Think bedtime means soft pillows and quiet darkness, not in a Crusader's camp. Imagine crawling under stiff wool, surrounded by the clatter of armor, the snoring of men who hadn't bathed in weeks, and the distant howl of danger. In this strange and sacred world of faith and fear, going to bed meant clutching your sword tighter than your blanket tanned, praying you'd wake up, curl up, dust, and drift into the forgotten corners of medieval nights. Hit that bell icon and subscribe for more sleepy journeys through history's least cozy moments. Tell me, would you have dared to close your eyes in a Crusader's tent? Drop a comment. You are standing in a muddy field somewhere in Anatolia. The year is 1097, and the sun has just disappeared behind distant hills that might hide Turkish raiders or nothing at all. Around you, several thousand other members of the First Crusade are performing what has become, over months of marching, a ritual as automatic as breathing. They are preparing for sleep. But what this means, what going to bed actually entails when you are a medieval warrior. Hundreds of miles from home, it's a process that would seem both familiar and utterly alien to someone from our modern world. The night beside you. A man named Godfrey, whose surname you've never learned, begins the familiar choreography of unpacking his hearbed. This is not simply a matter of rolling out a sleeping bag or inflating an air mattress. The hearbed literally meaning army. Bed in the medieval German dialect represents a carefully regulated system of portable comfort that has been legally mandated by feudal law. These portable beds were part of the hearwed, the military equipment that a knight's son would inherit, as essential to warfare as his sword or his horse. Godfrey's servant for even minor knights traveled with at least one attendant begins, laying out the components of his master's sleeping arrangement with the methodical precision of a surgeon. First comes the mattress, a rectangular creation stuffed with raw wool that has been compressed during weeks of travel into something resembling a partially deflated cushion. The stuffing, originally fluffy and inviting, now carries the accumulated moisture of countless nights in damp conditions, creating a weight and density that speaks to the reality of medieval military life. The mattress is not simply thrown upon the ground. Medieval warriors understood, through hard-won experience, that the earth itself was an enemy of comfortable sleep. The servant carefully examines the chosen spot, looking for stones, roots, or dips that would create pressure points through the thin barrier of wool and cloth. This is not mere fastidiousness, is the difference between being able to function the following day and waking with aches that could prove fatal in combat. The ground is swept clear with a bundle of twigs, and sometimes small stones are gathered to create a level foundation. Next comes the selection of the cover. Godfrey possesses what the military regulations would classify as a quilted bed cover, something approaching what we might recognize as a primitive duvet. But the reality is less comfortable than the term suggests. The outer fabric has been patched multiple times, and the internal stuffing has shifted during travel, creating thin spots and thick lumps that make for uneven warmth. In wealthier camps, some nobles might have fur covers bears, wolves, or deer killed during the journey, but these represent luxury exceptions rather than common practice. The pillow arrives next, though calling it by this familiar name almost misrepresents what it actually is. Medieval military pillows were typically stuffed with down when they began their journey. But months of use and the impossibility of proper maintenance meant that the down had become matted, occasionally damp, and compressed into something more resembling a small, lumpy sack than anything designed for comfort. Some knights carried a bolster pillow as well, a cylindrical cushion that could weigh up to 8.5 kilograms, according to 14th century sumptuary laws from Lubeck. Though by the time it reached the field, it often felt much heavier. The servant then produces the sleeping sheets. These represent perhaps the greatest luxury in the entire arrangement, made of linen, or in exceptional cases, silk. They offer the promise of a barrier between the sleeper's skin and the increasingly dubious cleanliness of the other bedding components. But even these sheets tell a story of compromise with reality. They have been washed infrequently, when water and soap could be spared from more pressing military needs. They have been mended repeatedly, creating a patchwork of different fabric types and colors. They carry stains that speak to the difficulty of maintaining any standard of cleanliness while living in constant movement through hostile territory. The construction of the here bed follows a specific sequence that has been refined through generations of military experience. The mattress is positioned first, oriented to take advantage of any natural windbreaker nearby rock, the side of a cart, or simply the lie side of a tent. The sheets are stretched across it, pulled tight and tucked under the edges with the kind of precision that military life demands of every activity. The pillow and bolster are positioned according to the sleeper's preference, though these preferences have usually been modified by experience to accommodate the realities of sleeping in armor or with weapons within easy reach. But here, as you watch Godfrey's servant work, you begin to understand that the here bed is not simply about comfort. It is about maintaining a connection to civilization and circumstances that constantly threaten to reduce human beings to their most basic survival instincts. The ritual of assembling this portable bed, component by component, represents a deliberate act of creating domesticity in the midst of mortal danger. It is a declaration that despite being hundreds of miles from home, despite sleeping on ground that might be contested by enemy forces before sunrise, despite the constant possibility of death or injury, these medieval warriors will maintain the forms and structures that define them as civilized human beings rather than mere armed survivors. The question that emerges, as darkness settles over the camp and thousands of similar preparations take place in the growing gloom, is whether this elaborate ritual of comfort actually provided comfort, or whether it served some other, perhaps more important psychological function. What happens when the familiar routines of domestic life are transported into circumstances that mock their very purpose? As full darkness settles over the camp, the here bed transforms from a construction project into a sleeping environment, and the true nature of rest in a Crusader army reveals itself. You lie down beside Godfrey on your own carefully assembled bed for even common soldiers, carried some version of this portable sleeping system, and immediately understand why the medieval military mind devoted such attention to the precise arrangement of bedding components. The ground beneath, despite careful preparation, conducts cold upward through the wool mattress with relentless efficiency. Your body heat, the only source of warmth available, must be conserved and directed through the strategic layering of covers and the careful positioning of limbs. The sleeping sheet against your skin provides a psychological comfort that transcends its practical function. Clean linen, or the memory of clean linen, represents connection to a domestic world where such luxuries existed. But physical reality intrudes quickly. The sheet has absorbed moisture from previous nights, carrying the accumulated dampness of weeks of travel through varying weather conditions. It clings to your skin in some places and pulls away in others, creating drafts that defeat the careful heat conservation the bedding is designed to provide. The bolster pillow presents its own complex relationship with comfort. Positioned correctly, it supports the natural curve of your neck while providing elevation for your head that aids both breathing and awareness of sounds in the surrounding camp. But the 8-kilogram weight that seemed manageable during daylight hours now becomes a challenge to position and reposition as you search for sustainable comfort. The down stuffing, compressed by months of use, has formed hard lumps separated by flat areas, creating a landscape of pressure points that change as your head moves during the gradual descent toward sleep. Your armor presents the most complex element in the sleeping equation. The conventional wisdom, perpetuated in popular imagination, suggests that medieval knights slept fully armored, ready for immediate combat. The reality is more nuanced and infinitely more uncomfortable. complete armor mail hauberks, coifs, shows, and the metal reinforcements that protect vital areas represents approximately 40 to 60 pounds of weight distributed across the human body. Sleeping in full armor is possible and occasionally necessary when enemy contact is imminent, but it comes at a severe cost to actual rest. The compromise position adopted by experienced Crusaders involved partial disarming guided by tactical assessment. The hauberk, the long mail shirt that protects the torso, might be loosened but left in place if intelligence suggested the possibility of night attack. The coif mail, hood protecting head and neck, could be removed to allow for better hearing and more comfortable head positioning, though this meant trusting the camp's perimeter guards to provide adequate early warning of danger. Shows mail leggings often remained in place because the effort of removal and replacement in darkness outweighed their discomfort during sleep. Weapons placement requires its own careful consideration within the geography of the hearbed. The sword must be positioned for immediate access, but not in a location where movement during sleep might cause injury, or where it could be easily grabbed by an attacker. Most experienced Crusaders developed personal systems, the sword placed along the right side of the body within easy reach of the dominant hand, parallel to the body's length to minimize the risk of accidental contact during sleep movements. The dagger received similar consideration but was often kept even closer, sometimes actually worn during sleep when circumstances demanded maximum readiness. The psychological dimension of sleep in hostile territory cannot be separated from its physical aspects. Your mind, despite the exhaustion accumulated through a day of marching in armor while carrying supplies and maintaining formation, cannot fully surrender to unconsciousness. Medieval military experience had taught generations of warriors that the transition period between wakefulness and sleep represented maximum vulnerability. The sounds of camp life conversations from nearby groups, the movement of horses, the crackle of fires, the distant challenges of sentries must be mentally sorted into familiar and potentially threatening categories even as consciousness fades. But perhaps most significantly, the hearbed creates a bounded space of personal territory within the collective vulnerability of army camp life. The carefully assembled bed, with its familiar components arranged in familiar ways, becomes a temporary home that moves from place to place. It represents not just a place to sleep, but an assertion of individual identity within the mass anonymity of military service. The specific arrangement of bedding, the personal items kept close at hand, the particular way of positioning weapons and armor, these details create a continuity of self that persists through the constant change and danger of campaign life. The wool mattress beneath you gradually warms from body heat, but this warming process reveals its own problems. The wool, packed tightly during transport, begins to expand slightly as it heats, creating lumps and valleys that change the sleeping surface throughout the night. Areas that seemed flat during initial positioning develop ridges that press into ribs or hips. The accumulated moisture within the wool absorbed during previous nights and never fully dried begins to evaporate, creating humidity within the careful space bounded by covers and sheets. As you lie there, listening to the breathing of nearby soldiers and the distant sounds of camp guards, you begin to understand that the hearbed represents medieval civilization's attempt to impose domestic order upon military chaos. But you also begin to question whether the elaborate ritual of its assembly, careful attention to its components, and the nightly recreation of this portable domestic space actually produced rest, or whether it served some deeper need to maintain human dignity in circumstances that constantly challenged it. What happens to sleep when comfort itself becomes an act of defiance against hostile circumstances? Dawn arrives with the sound of camp beginning to stir, horses stamping and nickering as they sense human activity. The clink of mail as early risers begin their own preparations, the low murmur of voices discussing the day's planned march. you wake, as medieval soldiers learned to wake, not from having slept deeply, but from having dozed lightly enough to remain alert to changes in the camp's rhythm. The here bed beneath and around you has been transformed by a night's use from a carefully assembled sleeping system into something that more honestly represents the reality of military rest. Your body emerges from sleep carrying the accumulated compromises that the night has imposed. The bolster pillow repositioned multiple times during the night as you sought sustainable comfort, now lies displaced from its original carefully planned position. Your neck carries the stiffness that comes from sleeping on surfaces that provide support without providing genuine comfort. The wool mattress, which had seemed adequately prepared in the evening's inspection, now reveals pressure points where stones or roots pressed upward through wool and cloth with unrelenting persistence. The sleeping sheets, those precious barriers between your skin and the increasingly dubious cleanliness of the other bedding components, have twisted and pulled during the night's restless movements. What began as a smooth, even surface now bunches in some places and stretches thin in others, creating a topography that speaks to the impossibility of maintaining domestic standards in military circumstances. The linen carries your body's odor more intensely after a night of close contact, and you face the daily decision of whether to continue using sheets that offer psychological comfort at the cost of increasing physical unpleasantness, or to pack them away until they can be properly cleaned in an event that might not occur for weeks. But as you sit up and begin the process of disassembling your portable bed, you observe something remarkable happening throughout the camp. Thousands of other Crusaders are performing the same morning ritual, and their actions reveal the true significance of the here bed system. Each warrior, from the greatest noble to the most humble foot soldier, begins his day by carefully packing away the components of his sleeping arrangement. The mattress is compressed back into traveling form, strapped tightly to minimize its bulk during the day's march. The covers are folded with the kind of precision that military life demands of tick skew. I've seen every activity. The sheets are smoothed, inspected for damage, and packed in whatever manner will best preserve them for the next. Nights use this morning ritual represents something more profound than simple camp maintenance. It demonstrates how medieval military culture had developed systems to maintain human dignity in circumstances specifically designed to strip it away. The careful attention given to bedding components, it's a precise sequence followed in both assembly and disassembly. The individual variations that each warrior developed in response to his own physical needs and preferences, all of these details reveal a sophisticated understanding of the psychological requirements of military service. Godfrey, the knight whose evening preparations you had observed, now demonstrates the morning aspect of here bed management. His servant works with the same methodical precision shown the previous evening. But now the goal is to transform the scattered components of a night's sleep into a compact, transportable unit that will survive a day's march and be ready for immediate deployment when evening comes again. The servant examines each component for damage, checking seams in the mattress for tears that might allow stuffing to escape, inspecting covers for rips that might compromise their effectiveness, looking for wear in the sheets that might indicate impending failure. This inspection process reveals the economic reality behind the medieval military sleeping system. The here bed represents a significant investment, months or years of a craftsman's work. Materials that might cost the equivalent of several months' income for an ordinary worker, and ongoing maintenance requirements that demand constant attention. When the system fails, when mattresses develop irreparable tears, when covers become too damaged to provide warmth, when sheets deteriorate beyond the possibility of mending, the replacement cost represents a major financial burden for all but the wealthiest participants in the crusade. Yet this economic investment also demonstrates the medieval understanding that effective military service required more than just weapons and armor. The legal requirement that knights maintain a here bed As part of their military equipment reflected a recognition that soldiers who could not rest effectively could not fight effectively. It's a careful regulation of bedding components in military. Law represented not luxury, but tactical necessity. Armies that failed to maintain their soldiers' ability to recover from the physical demands of campaign life would find themselves fielding forces too exhausted to function in combat. As the camp continues its morning transformation from sleeping area to departure point, you begin to see the here-bed system within its larger historical context. These portable beds represent medieval civilization's attempt to solve a fundamental problem: how to maintain human beings as effective fighting forces while subjecting them to conditions that challenge every aspect of normal human existence. The solution was not to eliminate discomfort. Medieval military technology could not achieve that goal, but to create systems that made discomfort manageable and sustainable over extended periods. The legacy of the here-bed extends beyond its immediate military function. The legal frameworks that regulated its components, the craft traditions that produced its materials, the maintenance skills that preserved its effectiveness. Wealthy say, wal ne sol. Of these elements contributed to broader medieval understandings of the relationship between comfort and duty, between individual needs and collective requirements, between domestic life and military service. The portable bed was not just a sleeping system, but a philosophical statement about what it meant to be human in circumstances that challenged humanity itself. But as you finish packing your own bedding components and prepare to join the forming marching column, one question persists. The here bed provided a systematic approach to the problem of military rest, but did it actually provide rest? Or did it serve some other function, psychological, social, or spiritual, that was perhaps more important than physical comfort in sustaining medieval warriors through the extraordinary demands of crusading warfare? The careful attention devoted to its assembly and maintenance suggests that its true value might lie in domains that transcend the merely physical requirements of sleep. The sun has been down for 2 hours, and you are walking the perimeter of the Crusader camp with the measured pace that experience has taught you is sustainable through the long night ahead. Your feet follow a path that has been worn smooth by the boots of previous guards, a circuit that takes exactly 12 minutes to complete when walked at the proper speed. This timing is not accidental. Medieval military science, developed through generations of bitter experience, had determined that guard effectiveness required a careful balance between alertness and endurance, between observation and movement, between individual vigilance and systematic coverage. You carry a spear as your primary weapon, though a sword hangs at your side and a dagger rests within easy reach. The spear serves multiple purposes beyond combat readiness. Its length allows you to probe suspicious shadows without moving close enough to spring potential traps. Its metal point can tap against rocks, wooden posts, or tent stakes to create sounds that carry specific meanings to other guards and to the camp's occupants. Most importantly, its weight and the necessity of carrying it in a ready position helps maintain the state of physical alertness that keeps guards effective through the gradual numbing effects of long night watches. The camp you are guarding represents a complex exercise in medieval military engineering. The tents are arranged not randomly, but according to a hierarchical pattern that serves both social and defensive purposes. The command tent occupies the center, elevated on the highest available ground to provide visual command of the surrounding area. Around it, in concentric rings of decreasing status and increasing vulnerability, spread the shelters of knights, men-at-arms, foot soldiers, and camp followers. But this arrangement serves purposes beyond mere social organization. The outer ring of the most expendable personnel creates a human early warning system. Enemy forces attempting night attacks must first encounter and overcome the camp's perimeter before reaching the more valuable military assets at its center. The graduated response this arrangement provides allows for different levels of alarm and different tactical responses, depending on where an attack develops and how far its spore penetrates before being contained or repelled. Your patrol route has been designed to provide overlapping coverage with other guards whose circuits intersect yours at carefully planned intervals. Every 6 minutes, you encounter Robert, a man-at-arms from Normandy whose scarred face testifies to experience in night fighting. Every 8 minutes, you cross paths with Wilhelm, a crossbowman whose weapon gives him capability against targets at longer range than your spear can reach. These encounters are not social meetings, but tactical checkpoints, brief moments. When you exchange information about anything unusual observed during your separate circuits. Confirm that all guards remain alert and effective, and provide mutual verification that no guard position has been compromised by enemy infiltration. The darkness itself becomes an ally and an enemy simultaneously. Your eyes, after 2 hours of gradual adjustment, can distinguish shapes and movements that would be invisible to someone emerging suddenly from the firelit interior of the camp. You can see the difference between the natural movement of bushes in wind and the unnatural movement that might indicate human presence. You can distinguish between the sounds of horses settling for the night and the sounds of horses reacting to unfamiliar presence. These skills represent the accumulated wisdom of medieval night fighting, passed down through generations of soldiers who learned that survival often depended on the ability to interpret subtle signals in conditions of limited visibility. But this heightened night vision comes at a cost. Looking directly at the camp's fires, even briefly, destroys the dark adaptation that took hours to develop. Moving too quickly from shadow to moonlight creates momentary blindness that could be fatal if timed to coincide with enemy action. Even the natural human tendency to focus visual attention on movement must be consciously controlled, since peripheral vision proves more effective than direct observation for detecting motion in low light conditions. The sounds of the night create a complex auditory landscape that must be continuously monitored and interpreted. The camp itself produces a constant background of noise, horses moving in their picket lines, soldiers shifting position in their sleep, the occasional conversation between men who cannot achieve rest, the crackle and pop of fires being maintained at minimum levels to provide emergency light without creating unnecessary visibility for enemy observation. These familiar sounds must be mentally filtered out to allow attention to focus on the unfamiliar sounds that might indicate danger. Beyond the camp's immediate perimeter lies a different auditory environment, the natural sounds of night wind. Moving through vegetation, the movement of small animals. The distant calls of night birds create patterns that experienced guards learn to recognize as normal. Changes in these patterns often provide the earliest warning of human movement. In the surrounding area, birds that suddenly stop calling, small animals that flee from areas where they normally forage, wind patterns that change as they encounter obstacles that should not be there. All of these signals can indicate the approach of enemy forces long before visual contact becomes possible. Your clothing and equipment have been selected and arranged to support the specific requirements of night watch duty. The mail hauberk you wear provides protection against sudden attack, but its weight and the way it restricts movement represent compromises with the demands of staying alert and mobile through long hours of patrol. The sword at your side is positioned for quick draw with the dominant hand while leaving the other hand free to maintain grip on the spear. A water container, carefully positioned to avoid creating noise during movement, allows you to maintain hydration without leaving your assigned patrol route. But perhaps most significantly, you carry a horn, a simple instrument made from animal bone or carved wood that can produce sounds audible throughout the camp and 2 guards on adjacent sectors. This horn represents the medieval military solution to the problem of communication during night operations. Different sequences of notes convey different types of information: enemy sighting, request for relief, medical emergency, or the simple confirmation that guard posts remain active and alert. The horn calls can summate assistance without requiring guards to abandon their positions, and they provide a means of coordinating defensive responses across the entire perimeter simultaneously as you continue your circuit, passing sleeping tents where warriors recover from the day's march and prepare for tomorrow's challenges. You begin to understand that your role as night guard represents something more complex than simple perimeter defense. You are maintaining a barrier between the vulnerable, domestic space of the sleeping camp and the hostile uncertainty of the surrounding night. But you are also part of a system of collective vigilance that allows civilization to rest while remaining ready to defend itself. The question that begins to emerge from this understanding is whether night watch duty represents merely a tactical necessity, or whether it serves some deeper function in maintaining the psychological coherence of the army as a whole. 3 hours into your watch, the camp has settled into the deep rhythms of military sleep. The conversations have faded to occasional murmurs. The movement of restless sleepers has decreased to the minimal shifting that represents the body's unconscious search for sustainable positions, and even the horses have found their own version of rest, standing alert but relaxed, ready to respond to sudden need, but no longer actively restless. This is when night watch duty reveals its true psychological complexity, as the external vigilance required by military necessity encounters the internal challenges of maintaining alertness through the long hours before dawn. Your mind, a spite. The crucial importance of your role begins to engage in a mental wandering that represents the human response to extended periods of repetitive activity. The 12-minute circuit that seems simple and straightforward at the beginning of your watch has now been completed 15 times, and familiarity breeds a dangerous kind of mental automation. Your feet follow the established path, your eyes continue their scanning pattern, your ears remain attuned to the sounds of potential danger. But your conscious attention begins to drift toward memories of home, speculation about future events, or simple daydreaming that provides relief from the immediate demands of vigilance. This mental drift represents one of the fundamental challenges of medieval night watch duty. The state of consciousness required for effective guard duty, tailored but not tense, observant but not hypervigilant, ready but not exhausted by readiness, proves difficult to maintain for the 4 to 6 hours that typically constituted a night watch shift. Too much intensity leads to exhaustion that renders the guard ineffective in the crucial hours before dawn, when attacks were most likely to occur. Too little intensity allows the guard to miss the subtle signs that provide early warning of approaching danger. The solution developed by medieval military practice involved deliberate techniques for managing consciousness during extended watch duty. Physical movement, the measured pace of patrol, the conscious shifting of weight from foot to foot during stationary observation, the periodic adjustment of equipment and weapons serves to maintain blood circulation and prevent the gradual numbness that accompanies prolonged immobility. Mental exercises, counting circuits, reciting prayers or familiar songs silently, reviewing tactical procedures provide structured activity for consciousness without creating distraction from the primary surveillance mission. But perhaps most importantly, experienced guards learn to use the solitude and silence of night watch as an opportunity for a particular kind of introspection that daylight military activity made impossible. The repetitive physical activity of patrol, combined with the necessity of remaining alert to external stimuli, creates a mental state that allows for deep reflection on personal and spiritual questions without losing tactical effectiveness. Many medieval writings describe night watch duty as a time of profound spiritual contemplation, when the combination of physical vigilance and mental solitude created conditions conducive to prayer, meditation, and the kind of self-examination that medieval Christian culture considered essential to spiritual development. Your fellow guards, encountered at their regular intervals during circuit intersections, revealed different approaches to managing the psychological challenges of night watch. Robert, the Norman man-at-arms, maintains alertness through a systematic mental review of combat techniques, visualizing different attack scenarios, and rehearsing the appropriate responses until the physical movements become automatic reactions that could be executed even in states of partial consciousness. Wilhelm, the crossbowman, uses the time to maintain his weapon, cleaning and adjusting components with the kind of methodical precision that keeps both hands and mind occupied while maintaining readiness for immediate action. These individual approaches to night watch psychology reveal the broader medieval understanding that effective military service required not just physical courage and technical skill, but also the mental disciplines necessary to function effectively under conditions of prolonged stress and uncertainty. The guard who could not manage his own consciousness during long night watches would eventually fail in his fundamental mission of protecting the sleeping army. The development of personal systems for maintaining alertness represented not luxury, but tactical necessity. The camp around you, as the night progresses toward its deepest hours, begins to reveal the complex relationship between sleep and security that defines military life. The warriors resting in their carefully assembled hearbed depend absolutely on your vigilance for their safety. But your ability to maintain that vigilance depends on the knowledge that your own rest, when your watch ends, will be similarly protected by others. This mutual dependence creates a psychological bond that transcends the formal hierarchy of military organization. The recognition that survival depends not just on individual competence, but on collective reliability. But the darkness also reveals aspects of camp life that daylight obscures or minimizes. You can hear more clearly than during the day's activities the sounds of sickness coughing that speaks to respiratory ailments, the restless movement of fever, the occasional groans of pain from wounds or illness. You can smell more acutely. In the still night air, the odors of inadequate sanitation, unwashed bodies, and the gradual decay of food supplies that cannot be properly preserved under campaign conditions. These sensory experiences remind you that the camp you are guarding represents not just a military formation, but a collection of human beings struggling to maintain health and dignity under conditions that challenge both. The psychological burden of night watch extends beyond the immediate requirements of maintaining alertness. As a guard, you become witness to the vulnerability of the sleeping army in ways that daylight military activities do not reveal. You see soldiers struggling with nightmares, crying out in their sleep as they relive combat experiences or worry about families left behind. You observe the restless movement of men who cannot achieve genuine rest despite their exhaustion. You become aware of the conversations between wakeful soldiers who discuss fears, doubts, and concerns that they would never voice during the day's military activities. This witness role creates its own psychological challenges. The knowledge of collective vulnerability that comes with night watch duty must be balanced against the necessity of maintaining confidence in the Army's strength and capabilities. The guard who becomes too conscious of the camp's weaknesses might lose the psychological certainty necessary for effective defensive action. But the guard who ignores these realities might fail to recognize genuine threats to the Army's cohesion and effectiveness. As the night progresses toward its fourth hour, you find yourself questioning not just the immediate tactical situation, but the broader meaning of your role. Is night watch duty simply a practical necessity imposed by the requirements of military security? Or does it serve some deeper function in maintaining the psychological structure that allows groups of human beings to function as effective military units? What happens to armies that sleep without adequate vigilance? And what happens to the individuals who provide that vigilance through the long, solitary hours of the medieval night? The eastern horizon shows the first pale suggestion of approaching dawn as you complete your 28th circuit of the camp perimeter. Your legs carry the deep ache that comes from hours of measured walking in armor. Your eyes burn from the strain of continuous surveillance in limited light. And your mind moves with the peculiar clarity that accompanies prolonged alertness simultaneously. Sharp and fragile, capable of instant response to immediate threats, but increasingly vulnerable to the mistakes that come with accumulated fatigue. The camp around you begins to show the subtle signs of approaching morning before the sun itself becomes visible. Horses shift position more frequently, sensing the approach of the day's activities through instincts that human beings have partially lost. Early risers among the soldiers begin the quiet preparations that will accelerate into the full activity of breaking camp once light becomes adequate for complex tasks. Cooking fires, banked carefully through the night to avoid excessive visibility, begin to show signs of being fed additional fuel in preparation for the morning meal. Your relief approaches from the direction of the Camp Centaura night named. Jeffrey, whose well-maintained equipment and confident bearing mark him as someone of higher status than your own. The transition of guard duty between individuals of different rank creates its own protocol complexities. Jeffrey technically outranks you in the military hierarchy, but your 6 hours of continuous observation have given you information about the current tactical situation that he needs for effective assumption of guard responsibilities. The exchange that takes place represents a careful balance between respect for social hierarchy and the practical requirements of military effectiveness. The night has been quiet, you report, following the formula developed for guard transitions. No unusual movement observed in sectors 2 or 4. A cart passed on the road to the east approximately 4 hours ago, moving south to distant, for positive identification, but maintaining steady pace consistent with legitimate travel. Robert reports hearing movement in the forest to the north around midnight, but subsequent observation revealed deer rather than human activity. Wilhelm observed a light to the west that appeared and disappeared 3 times approximately 2 hours ago, but its location and behavior suggested a farm settlement rather than military signal. Jeffrey nods, absorbing this information with the kind of attention that experienced night fighters give to seemingly minor details. In medieval warfare, where intelligence gathering occurred primarily through direct observation and where enemy movements often preceded attacks by hours or days, the accumulated observations of night guards provided crucial tactical information. The cart moving south might represent legitimate commerce, or it might indicate enemy reconnaissance. The light observed to the west could mark a friendly settlement, or it could represent enemy forces signaling between separate groups. These details would be integrated with similar reports from other guards and from daytime observations to create the ongoing assessment of threat levels that guided military decision-making. But the transition between guards involves more than the simple exchange of tactical information. Jeffrey must quickly adapt to the specific conditions that have developed during your watch, the particular shadows cast by cloud formations, the current wind patterns that affect how sounds carry across the landscape, the gradual changes in temperature and humidity that influence everything from equipment performance to human alertness levels. You point out areas where recent rain has created muddy patches that might reveal footprints, locations where equipment has been positioned to provide emergency cover if perimeter defense becomes necessary, and subtle features of the local terrain that prove relevant to defensive planning. Most significantly, you must communicate the current feel of the night, the subjective assessment of danger, levels that experienced guards develop through prolonged exposure to the subtle indicators that suggest weather conditions are genuinely peaceful or merely temporarily quiet. This intuitive understanding proves difficult to communicate through formal military language, but it often provides the most important guidance for the guard taking over responsibility for camp security as you walk back toward the camp center. In your own delayed rest, you observe the beginning of the day's transformation from sleeping army to active military force. The process reveals the careful coordination required to transition several thousand people from rest to readiness while maintaining security. Throughout the vulnerable period when attention focuses on internal organization rather than external threats, guards like Jeffrey taking over perimeter security with fresh alertness. Allow this transformation to proceed safely while preserving the continuity of vigilance that military effectiveness requires. Your own hearbed awaits you. Carefully positioned in the location assigned to your status and role within the Army's hierarchy. The familiar ritual of preparing for sleep takes on different meaning after a night spent observing others rest. The mattress, covers, and pillows that seemed adequate when assembled in daylight now represent luxury beyond measure, private. Space where consciousness can finally surrender the hypervigilance that night watch demands. But even as you lie down and feel your body begin to relax from its hours of controlled alertness, part of your mind remains attuned to the sounds of the camp, ready to respond if Jeffrey's horn call signals danger before your own rest is complete. The morning light, gradually strengthening as it filters through the fabric of your tent, illuminates a camp that has successfully survived another night through the collective vigilance of its guards. The thousands of sleeping warriors, the vital supplies, the weapons and equipment necessary for continued military operations, all have been preserved through the dark hours by a system of organized watchfulness that represents one of medieval warfare's most essential but least celebrated achievements. But as sleep finally begins to claim your consciousness, questions persist about the broader meaning of night watch duty within medieval military culture. The system clearly served its practical purpose of providing security, but it also created a framework within which individuals learned to manage extreme responsibility under conditions of isolation and potential danger. Did the psychological disciplines developed during night watch contribute to other aspects of medieval military effectiveness? Did the experience of solitary vigilance serve functions beyond immediate tactical necessity? The institution of night watch represents medieval society's systematic approach to one of military life's fundamental challenges: how to maintain collective security while allowing individual rest. The solution required not just tactical organization, but psychological preparation. It's not just physical courage, but mental discipline. Not just individual competence, but reliable integration with larger systems of mutual dependence. As you drift toward sleep, protected by Jeffrey's fresh vigilance as you protected others through the hours of darkness, you become part of the continuing cycle that allowed medieval armies to function as coherent military forces rather than collections of individual warriors. But the deeper questions about what this system meant to the individuals who participated in it and how it shaped their understanding of duty, responsibility, and human interdependence remain as complex and mysterious as the medieval night itself. Dawn reveals the Crusader camp as a vast text written in canvas and rope, where every tent, every sleeping arrangement, every square foot of allocated space tells a story about power, status, and the careful gradations of privilege that defined medieval society, even in the midst of holy war. You stand at the edge of what the Army's marshals have designated as the command area, looking outward through concentric rings of humanity arranged according to principles that govern not just where people sleep, but how they sleep, what they sleep on, and who shares the dangerous gift of rest in hostile territory. At the center of this carefully orchestrated arrangement stands the command pavilion, not merely a tent, but a portable palace that demonstrates how medieval concepts of hierarchy followed armies into the field. The structure itself rises twice the height of ordinary tents, its peaked roof crowned with banners that identify its occupant and establish his authority over the sprawling camp below. Constructed from panels of heavy cloth dyed in expensive colors, deep reds, royal blues, gold-threaded greens that catch and hold the morning light. It announces its importance through materials that represent wealth measured in years of ordinary soldiers' wages. But the pavilion's true significance lies not in its visual impact, but in the domestic space it creates within military circumstances. Inside, behind walls thick enough to provide genuine privacy, the Army's commander maintains living conditions that approximate the domestic arrangements of his peacetime castle. His bedknot, a portable hearbed, like the equipment carried by lesser soldiers, but actual furniture transported in pieces and assembled by skilled carpenters occupies a separate chamber within the larger structure. The sleeping surface consists of a substantial mattress filled with the finest down, supported by a wooden frame that elevates it above the ground and provides storage space. Beneath 4 personal items and weapons, the bedding itself represents a level of luxury that distinguishes command-level rest from the compromised comfort available to subordinates. Sheets of fine linen, changed regularly by servants whose duties include maintaining domestic standards under field conditions, provide clean barriers against skin that need not endure the accumulated grime that lower-ranking soldiers accept as unavoidable. Multiple pillows stuffed with down and feathers and covered in fabric that matches the sheets support different sleeping positions and preferences. Covers range from lightweight summer blankets to heavy fur-lined robes designed for winter campaigns, all maintained in condition that would be acceptable in the commander's permanent residence. Surrounding the command pavilion, at distances carefully calculated to demonstrate proximity to power while maintaining appropriate space for the activities of leadership, stand the tents of high-ranking nobles, counts, barons, and knights whose personal wealth and social position earn them accommodation that reflects their status. These structures, while smaller than the command pavilion, still represent significant investments in portable comfort. The tents themselves are constructed from quality materials, designed to provide genuine protection against weather while maintaining the dignity appropriate to their occupant's social position. Inside these noble tents, the sleeping arrangements reveal the medieval understanding that comfort represents not luxury, but a practical necessity for maintaining the physical and mental effectiveness required for military leadership. The beds, while not reaching the elaborate construction of the command pavilion's furniture, still elevate sleepers above the ground on wooden frames or carefully constructed platforms. The mattresses, stuffed with wool or down depending on individual wealth, provide support that allows for genuine rest rather than the endured discomfort that characterizes lower-ranking soldiers' sleep. But perhaps most significantly, these high-status sleeping areas include space and provisions for activities that extend beyond mere rest. Chairs and tables allow for the conduct of business, the maintenance of correspondence, and the kind of administrative work that military campaigns require. Chests and storage containers hold clean clothing, personal items, and the documents necessary for command functions. Oil lamps or candles provide light for evening activities, creating domestic spaces within military circumstances that allow their occupants to maintain the intellectual and administrative capabilities that their leadership roles demand. Moving outward from the central area of privilege, the camp's organization becomes visible as a series of descending compromises with comfort. The tents of ordinary knightsmen whose social status grants them recognition as nobility, but whose personal wealth limits their ability to maintain. Elaborate establishments represent a middle ground between command, luxury, and common hardship. These structures provide privacy and basic weather protection, while acknowledging the economic constraints that prevent their occupants from replicating domestic comfort under field conditions. The sleeping arrangements within knights' tents reflect this compromised position. Their herebed, while conforming to the legal requirements for military equipment, represent the minimum standard acceptable for their social status. The mattresses are stuffed with wool rather than down, providing adequate support but lacking the luxurious softness available to their social superiors. The covers range from simple blankets to basic quilted bedding, effective for warmth but without the elegant materials that mark high-status accommodation. The sheets, while present to maintain the standards appropriate to knightly dignity, are of coarser linen and show the effects of extended use under field conditions. Yet even these modified assist important functions beyond mere comfort. The privacy provided by individual tents allows knights to maintain personal dignity while dealing with the physical challenges of campaign life. the space for personal belongings preserves connections to individual identity that could be lost in the mass anonymity of common soldiers' quarters. The elevated sleeping surfaces, while less elaborate than those enjoyed by higher nobility, still provide protection against the dampness and cold that ground-level rest entails, as the morning light strengthens and reveals more of the camp's organization. The next ring of accommodation becomes visible, the quarters assigned to men-at-arms, professional soldiers whose skill and experience earn them recognition above the level of common foot soldiers, but whose social status limits their access to individual accommodation. These men sleep in shared tents, typically housing 4 to 8 soldiers in a space that provides weather protection while acknowledging the economic realities that prevent individual luxury. The sleeping arrangements within these shared tents reveal medieval military pragmatism at its most essential level. Each soldier maintains his own bed, but space limitations require careful coordination of individual needs with collective functionality. The mattresses are thinner, stuffed with straw or the cheapest grades of wool, and designed more for portability than comfort. Covers consist primarily of blankets that serve double duty as traveling cloaks, sleeping covers, and emergency medical supplies. Sheets, when present at all, are shared commodities maintained collectively rather than individual possessions. But even at this level of accommodation, the principles of medieval social hierarchy remain visible. Within each tent, sleeping positions reflect military rank and social status, with senior soldiers claiming locations closer to tent walls that provide marginally better insulation, and newer or lower status members accepting positions in areas where cold drafts and ground dampness create additional discomfort. The outermost ring of the camp sleeping arrangements houses the foot soldiers, camp followers, servants, and others whose social status or economic situation relegates them to the most basic accommodation available within military organization. Here, the concept of individual sleeping space dissolves into collective arrangements that prioritize survival over comfort, function over dignity, and military necessity over personal preference. What emerges from this arrangement is a question that penetrates to the heart of medieval society. How did these vast differences in sleeping conditions affect not just physical comfort, but the psychological and social dynamics that determined whether such diverse groups of people could function as effective military units? As the morning progresses and the camp transforms from sleeping area to active military preparation, you begin to observe how the hierarchical arrangements of rest translate into different levels of physical and mental readiness for the day's challenges. The effects of status-based sleeping conditions extend far beyond mere comfort, creating cascading consequences that influence everything from tactical decision-making to the basic ability to function effectively in combat situations near the command pavilion. The Army's leader emerges from his quarters, displaying the kind of alertness and physical vigor that comes from genuine rest. His movements are crisp and decisive, his attention focused and systematic as he reviews the night's reports from guards and scouts. The quality sleep made possible by his elevated bed, clean bedding, and climate-controlled environment has allowed his body to recover completely from the previous day's exertions, while providing his mind the kind of deep rest that maintains the clarity necessary for complex military decision-making. This quality of rest represents more than personal comfort. It constitutes a tactical asset that affects the entire Army's effectiveness. Military campaigns depend on leaders who can process complex information quickly, make decisions under extreme pressure, and maintain the kind of mental acuity that distinguishes between tactical opportunities and potential disasters. The elaborate sleeping arrangements that seem to represent luxury actually serve the practical function of preserving the cognitive resources on which thousands of other soldiers depend for their survival. The nobles who occupied the second tier of accommodation emerge from their tents showing mixed results from their night's rest. those whose personal wealth allowed for better mattresses and bedding display energy levels approaching those of the high command, while others show signs of the compromised rest that comes from sleeping on surfaces that provide minimal comfort for periods measured in months rather than nights. But even the least well-rested among these high-status soldiers maintains advantages over their social inferiors through access to servants who have prepared morning meals, maintained clean clothing, and handled the routine tasks that allow their masters to focus attention on military responsibilities. This servant support system reveals another dimension of how sleeping hierarchies affect military effectiveness. The nobles who enjoy the best sleeping arrangements also benefit from support networks that extend the advantages of status beyond the sleeping period itself. Their servants, while often sleeping in conditions worse than those endured by common soldiers, provide services that multiply the benefits of superior rest. Clean clothing maintains health and morale. Prepared meals ensure adequate nutrition. Maintained equipment reduces the physical effort required for basic military functions. But the servants themselves occupy a complex position within the camp's hierarchy of rest. Their sleep occurs in the intervals between their master's needs, often interrupted by requirements for night service, early morning preparations, or security duties that prevent the continuous rest that effective physical recovery requires. Their sleeping arrangements typically consist of simple blankets spread on the ground near their master's tents, providing minimal protection against weather and elevation above the dampness that rises from the earth during nighttime hours. Moving to the shared tents of men-at-arms, the effects of compromised sleeping conditions become more apparent. These professional soldiers emerge from their quarters, showing signs of incomplete rest movements that lack the crisp precision of well-rested warriors. Attention that requires conscious effort to focus on immediate tasks and the subtle indicators of cumulative fatigue that build over extended campaign periods. The thin mattresses, shared quarters, and ground-level sleeping that characterize their accommodation prevent the deep, restorative sleep that allows complete recovery from the physical demands of military life. Yet these soldiers also demonstrate the adaptations that medieval warriors developed to function effectively despite compromised rest. Their movements, while lacking the fluid efficiency of well-rested individuals, show the careful economy of motion that conserves energy for essential tasks. Their attention, while requiring effort to maintain, reflects the disciplined focus that experienced soldiers learn to achieve regardless of fatigue levels. Their equipment, maintenance, and personal preparation reveal the systematic approaches that allow military effectiveness to persist even under conditions that challenge basic human needs. The shared nature of their sleeping arrangements creates its own dynamics that affect military effectiveness in complex ways. Soldiers who sleep in close proximity develop intimate knowledge of each other's strengths, limitations, health conditions, and psychological states. This knowledge proves valuable for military coordination and mutual support, but it also creates potential sources of tension when personality conflicts, hygiene problems, or individual weaknesses strain the social bonds that effective military units require. The snoring of one soldier disrupts the rest of 7 others. The restless movement of a man experiencing nightmares prevents his tent mates from achieving deep sleep. The illness of any individual affects the air quality and comfort of everyone sharing the enclosed space. These problems, multiplied across hundreds of shared tents, create collective impacts on army effectiveness that extend far beyond the individual level of discomfort. At the outermost edge of the camp's hierarchy, the foot soldiers and camp followers emerge from their minimal accommodations, carrying the accumulated effects of systematic sleep deprivation that builds over extended campaign periods. Their movements show the careful deliberation of people who must conserve energy because complete recovery proves impossible under their living conditions. Their attention requires constant effort to maintain focus on tasks that should be automatic. Their interactions reveal the irritability and reduced tolerance that accompany chronic fatigue, but even among these least privileged members of the military community. Social hierarchies affect sleeping conditions and their consequences. Experienced foot soldiers, through seniority or demonstrated competence, claim marginally better sleeping positions within their shared spaces. Specialist archers, crossbowmen, siege engineers whose technical skills make them valuable despite their low social status receive accommodations slightly superior to those of ordinary infantry. Even among the camp followers, gradations exist based on the value of services provided and the status of the masters they serve. The cumulative effect of these hierarchical sleeping arrangements creates an army, where different components operate at different levels of physical and mental capability. The question that emerges from this observation concerns not just military effectiveness, but the broader social implications of a system where the quality of rest, one of the most basic human needs, is distributed according to social status, rather than individual requirements for recovery and health. How did medieval armies function when their different components operated at such dramatically different levels of rest and recovery? What were the long-term consequences of a system that provided luxury accommodation for leaders, while subjecting common soldiers to conditions that prevented adequate rest? And what does this arrangement reveal about medieval understanding of the relationship between social hierarchy, individual needs, and collective effectiveness in extreme circumstances? By midday, as the army begins its march toward the next night's camping location, the cumulative effects of status-based sleeping arrangements have created an organization where different social levels function at dramatically different states of physical and mental capability. You can observe these differences in the pace of movement, the quality of attention, and the basic ability to respond effectively to the changing demands of military travel through potentially hostile territory. At the head of the marching column, the high command travels with a smooth efficiency that comes from complete rest and comprehensive support. The commander's horses, like their riders, have benefited from priority access to fodder and water, creating a mounted group that can maintain steady pace while remaining alert to tactical opportunities and potential dangers. The riders themselves display the kind of situational awareness that requires surplus mental energy, the ability to process information about terrain, weather conditions, and strategic possibilities while simultaneously maintaining the direct oversight that army movement requires. This cognitive surplus, maintained through quality rest, allows the leadership to function at levels that transcend basic survival and reaction. They can engage in the kind of forward planning that anticipates problems before they develop into crises, the strategic thinking that identifies opportunities for tactical advantage, and the complex coordination that keeps thousands of individuals moving as a coherent military unit. The elaborate sleeping arrangements that provided this capability proved their value through enhanced military effectiveness that benefits the entire army. But the price of leadership privilege becomes visible in the conditions of those whose inferior rest compromises their ability to function at optimal levels. The knights and men-at-arms who form the army's primary fighting force display increasing signs of cumulative fatigue as the march progresses. Their horses, while receiving better care than those of common soldiers, must carry riders whose own fatigue affects riding efficiency and tactical awareness. The men themselves show the subtle signs of incomplete recovery, marginally slower reactions, slightly reduced attention spans, and the kind of physical weariness that builds incrementally over extended campaign periods. These effects might seem minimal when observed during a single day's march, but their cumulative impact over weeks or months of campaigning creates significant degradation in fighting effectiveness. Knights whose sleep deprivation reduces their reaction times by fractions of seconds may find those fractions crucial in combat situations where survival depends on instantaneous response to changing circumstances. Men-at-arms whose compromised Rest affects their ability to maintain formation discipline, may create tactical vulnerabilities that enemy forces can exploit. More significantly, the hierarchical distribution of rest quality creates an army where different components operate on different time cycles of effectiveness. Well-rested leaders remain capable of sustained high-level performance, while progressively exhausted subordinates require increasingly frequent rest periods to maintain basic functional capacity. This misalignment between command capabilities and troop readiness creates coordination challenges that affect everything from march planning to combat coordination. The foot soldiers who bring up the rear of the marching column carry the most visible burden of systematic sleep deprivation. Their pace of movement reflects careful energy conservation rather than military urgency. Their formation discipline requires constant attention from sergeants and corporals, and their responsiveness to commands shows the delayed reactions that accompany chronic fatigue. Yet these soldiers must be capable of fighting effectively when the army encounters enemy resistance, despite carrying equipment loads similar to their better-rested superiors while operating at significantly reduced levels of physical and mental capacity. The camp followers and servants who accompany the army experience the most severe consequences of inferior sleeping conditions. Their roles require them to maintain the support functions that allow the military components to operate, effectively preparing meals, maintaining equipment, managing supplies, and handling the countless logistical tasks that keep armies functional. But they perform these essential duties while operating at the lowest levels of rest and recovery, creating a systemic inefficiency where the Army's support structure functions at compromised capacity. Precisely when military circumstances demand maximum effectiveness, yet within this apparently dysfunctional arrangement, medieval military culture had developed adaptive mechanisms that partially compensated for the hierarchical distribution of rest quality. Experienced sergeants and corporals learn to recognize the signs of dangerous fatigue levels in their subordinates and adjust duty assignments accordingly. Unit cohesion and mutual support systems allowed soldiers to share the burden of tasks that might overwhelm individuals operating at reduced capacity. Most importantly, the Army's organization acknowledged the reality of graduated exhaustion by assigning different types of responsibilities to soldiers based on their expected levels of capability. The question that emerges from this analysis concerns the long-term sustainability of military systems that distribute basic human needs according to social status rather than functional requirements. Medieval armies clearly managed to operate under these conditions. The historical record demonstrates their effectiveness in achieving military objectives despite the systematic exhaustion of large portions of their manpower. But what were the hidden costs of this approach, both in terms of human welfare and military effectiveness? The hierarchical sleeping arrangements reveal medieval society's fundamental assumption that social status should determine access to basic necessities, even when collective effectiveness might be enhanced by more egalitarian distribution of resources. The system prioritized the preservation of leadership capability while accepting the systematic degradation of subordinate performance, creating military organizations that functioned through the exploitation of social inferiors rather than the optimization of collective human potential. But this arrangement also reflects the practical realities of medieval logistics and economics. The resources necessary to provide quality sleeping arrangements for entire armies simply did not exist within the technological and economic constraints of medieval society. The concentration of available comfort-enhancing resources at the command level represented not arbitrary privilege, but rational allocation of scarce assets to preserve the decision-making capabilities on which military success ultimately depended. As evening approaches and the Army begins to select its next camping location, the cycle of hierarchical rest preparation begins again. The same social principles that govern the previous night's arrangements will create the same graduated distribution of comfort and exhaustion. perpetuating a system where sleep itself becomes a marker of social position and a determinant of individual capability. The question that persists through this repetition is whether medieval military effectiveness depended on hierarchical sleeping arrangements, or whether it succeeded despite them. And what does this system reveal about the broader relationship between social organization and human potential? In circumstances that challenge the basic requirements for individual and collective survival, darkness transforms the Crusader camp into a universe of sounds, each carrying information about the safety, health, and effectiveness of several thousand human beings. Attempting to rest in circumstances that challenge every assumption about what sleep requires, you lie on your carefully assembled hearbed, eyes closed but consciousness unable to surrender completely to slumber. As your ears become the primary instruments through which you monitor the complex auditory environment that surrounds military sleep in hostile territory, the tent fabric above and around you creates its own acoustic signature, subtle membrane that filters and modifies the sounds of the night, while adding its own contributions to the sonic landscape. Wind moving across the curved surfaces produces a low, continuous whisper that rises and falls with the changing air currents. When stronger gusts strike the tent, the fabric snaps taut with sharp reports that punctuate the gentler background. Rustling rain, when it comes, creates a drumming pattern that varies in intensity and rhythm depending on the size of droplets and the angle of their impact. But these weather sounds, while immediately audible, represent only the outermost layer of the camp's acoustic environment. Beneath them lies a complex tapestry of human-generated sounds that speaks to the physical and psychological state of the army attempting to rest. The breathing of nearby soldiers provides a constant background, rhythm sometimes regular, and deep when genuine sleep has been achieved. More often irregular and shallow as men struggle with discomfort, anxiety, or the hypervigilance that prevents complete unconsciousness in dangerous circumstances. Snoring creates its own geography within the camp's acoustic landscape. From different directions and distances come the varied sounds of obstructed breathing, from gentle, rhythmic rumbles that indicate peaceful sleep to harsh, choking sounds that suggest respiratory problems or sleeping positions that compromise airflow. These sounds carry information about the health status of individual soldiers, while creating acoustic disruptions that prevent rest for those sleeping nearby. The movements of restless sleepers contribute their own elements to the nighttime sound environment. The rustle of bedding as men search for comfortable positions. The creak of wooden tent supports as soldiers shift their weight. The soft sound of feet moving across ground coverings when individuals must leave their sleeping areas for personal needs all create a pattern of law-level activity that never completely stops throughout the night hours. Conversations form another layer in the acoustic landscape, ranging from urgent whispered exchanges between guards to the rambling, often incoherent talk of soldiers experiencing nightmares or fever dreams. Some conversations are purposeful reports of unusual sounds or sights, requests for assistance with equipment or medical problems, or the quiet discussions that help anxious men process the psychological challenges of campaign life. Others seem almost involuntary, the verbal expressions of minds that cannot achieve complete rest. Despite their body's desperate need for recovery, the horses contribute their own substantial presence to the camp's time soundscape. Their movements in the picket lines create a continuous background of shuffling hooves, the soft sound of animals grazing on available fodder, and the occasional more dramatic sounds of horses reacting to disturbances real or imagined in their environment. The snorting, nickering, and stamping of horses provides its own information system. Since experienced soldiers learn to distinguish between the sounds of animals responding to routine stimuli and the more urgent vocalizations that indicate genuine alarm or distress, equipment creates its own acoustic signature throughout the night. Metal components, mail armor, weapons, cooking implements scanned and contract with temperature changes, producing small metallic sounds that punctuate the quieter organic noises of sleeping humans and animals. Leather goods creak as they respond. 2. Humidity changes. Wooden components of tents, carts, and tools shift and settle as they adjust to the night's conditions. But perhaps most significantly, the sounds of bodily functions create an intimate and unavoidable dimension of camp life. That civilian experience rarely imposes on groups of people sleeping in close proximity. Coughing, particularly during cold weather or in conditions where respiratory illness spreads through close quarters, creates patterns that speak to both individual health problems and collective vulnerabilities. The sounds of digestive distress, inevitable. When large numbers of people consume unfamiliar foods, contaminated water, or provisions that have deteriorated during transport, provide unwelcome reminders of the physical challenges that constant military life creates for human bodies. The movement of people leaving their sleeping areas to visit latrine trenches creates traffic patterns that can be heard and tracked throughout the night. Footsteps moving away from tent areas, the sounds of men navigating obstacles in darkness, and the eventual return journeys create a continuous low-level activity that speaks to the basic human needs that must be accommodated even when military. Circumstances make privacy and dignity difficult to maintain. Guard activities contribute their own structured elements to the night's acoustic environment. The measured footsteps of sentries walking their prescribed routes, the occasional challenges issued to unknown sounds or movements, and the horn calls used to communicate between guard posts create patterns of sound that provide both security and reassurance to sleeping soldiers who depend on these activities for their safety. From greater distances come sounds that speak to the broader context of military operations. The howling of wolves or wild dogs attracted by the sense of food and human habitation. The calls of nightbirds whose patterns change when disturbed by unusual activity. And occasionally the sounds of human activity from distant settlements or other military forces whose proximity creates either comfort or concern depending on their identification as friendly or hostile. As you continue to lie listening to this complex symphony of military sleep, questions begin to emerge about how human beings adapt to such acoustic environments. What happens to rest quality when sleep must be achieved within such rich and often disturbing sound environments? How do soldiers learn to distinguish between sounds that require immediate attention and those that can be safely ignored? And what psychological effects result from prolonged exposure to the intimate sounds of large numbers of people struggling to maintain basic human dignity under conditions that challenge every aspect of normal domestic life? The sense of smell, perhaps more than any other aspect of sensory experience, reveals the harsh realities that underlie the romantic narratives often associated with medieval military campaigns. As you lie in your tent during the deep hours of the night, the absence of visual stimuli allows your nose to process the complex chemical information that speaks to the health, hygiene, and basic living conditions of several thousand human beings. Attempting to maintain military effectiveness while living in circumstances that challenge every aspect of normal sanitation and personal care, the most immediate and unavoidable element in the camp's olfactory environment comes from the accumulated effects of inadequate bathing and laundry facilities. While the Crusader states had inherited sophisticated bathing traditions from Roman and Arab cultures, armies in the field operated under constraints that made such luxuries impossible to maintain. The scent of unwashed human bodies concentrated within the enclosed spaces of tents and intensified by physical exertion creates an atmosphere that civilian experience rarely imposes on groups of people living in close proximity. This human odor represents more than mere provides information about the health and condition of individuals and groups within the Army. The sharp, acrid smell of fear-induced perspiration differs recognizably from the odors produced by physical exertion or normal body heat. The sweet, sickly scent that accompanies certain types of illness allows experienced soldiers to identify potential health problems before they become visible through other symptoms. The changes in body chemistry that accompany malnutrition, dehydration, or systemic infection create olfactory signals that informed observers can interpret as indicators of individual and collective military readiness. Clothing and bedding contribute their own complex elements to the nighttime scent environment. Wool garments and bedding components, exposed to moisture without adequate opportunities for thorough drying, develop the distinctive musty odor of organic materials undergoing slow decomposition. Linen sheets and undergarments, worn continuously and washed infrequently in water that may itself be less than clean, acquire accumulated odors that speak to the impossibility of maintaining domestic cleanliness. Standards under field conditions. The leather components of military equipment, armor, weapon sheaths, horse gear, and countless utilitarian items create their own distinctive contributions to the sensory environment. Leather exposed to repeated wetting and drying cycles develops odors ranging from the pleasant scents of well-maintained gear to the harsh, chemical smells of material beginning to deteriorate. When leather becomes thoroughly saturated and cannot dry properly, it produces odors that indicate potential equipment failure and the need for maintenance or replacement. Food storage, storage, and preparation create some of the most complex and variable elements in the camp's olfactory landscape. The sense of cooking bread baking in portable ovens, meat roasting over open fires, or the more common stews and porridges that constitute the bulk of military meals can provide comfort and promise of sustenance. But food storage under field conditions also produces less pleasant olfactory experiences. Grain that has been contaminated by moisture develops the distinctive sour smell of fermentation or the sharper odors of actual spoilage. Preserved meats, stored without adequate protection from heat and humidity, can develop chemical changes that make them dangerous to consume while producing warning odors that experienced soldiers learn to recognize the animals that accompany. Medieval armies contribute substantially to the overall olfactory environment. Horses, essential for mounted warfare and transportation, produce large quantities of waste that must be managed within the constraints of military movement. When camps remain stationary for extended periods, the accumulation of animal waste creates sanitation challenges that affect both immediate comfort and longer-term health considerations. The scents of healthy horses differ recognizably from those of animals suffering from illness, injury, or malnutrition, providing information about the condition of resources critical to military effectiveness. Human waste management represents perhaps the most challenging aspect of maintaining tolerable olfactory conditions within military camps. Medieval armies attempted to address sanitation through organized latrine systems, trenches dug at appropriate distances from sleeping and cooking areas. But the practical implementation of these systems under field conditions created ongoing challenges. The scents associated with inadequate waste management not only create immediate discomfort, but also indicate potential health hazards that could compromise the Army's fighting capability. Through disease outbreaks, the medical challenges of campaign, life contributes their own distinctive elements to the sensory environment. The odors associated with infected wounds, gangrene, or other medical conditions that medieval military medicine struggled to treat effectively create olfactory information that speaks to the human cost of warfare beyond the immediate casualties of combat. These medical odors often provide the earliest indication of health problems that could spread through close quarters if not identified and addressed promptly. Weather conditions dramatically affect the intensity and character of all these olfactory elements. Rain increases humidity levels that intensify odors while preventing the natural ventilation that helps disperse unpleasant scents. Heat accelerates the chemical processes that produce odors while making their effects more noticeable to human senses. Cold weather may reduce odor intensity, but also forces people to share enclosed spaces more closely, concentrating whatever scents remain active. But perhaps most significantly, the accumulated olfactory environment of military camp life represents a challenge to human dignity that extends beyond mere physical discomfort. The inability to escape unpleasant odors, combined with the knowledge that one's own contribution to the collective scent environment affects others in similar ways, creates psychological stresses that compound the other challenges of military life. How do human beings maintain morale, unit cohesion, and fighting effectiveness when forced to endure sensory conditions that assault basic preferences for cleanliness and personal space? As the night deepens toward its final hours before dawn, you begin to understand how the sensory experiences of sound and smell within the Crusader camp serve functions that extend beyond mere endurance of unpleasant conditions. The complex acoustic and olfactory environment that initially seemed like obstacles to rest gradually reveals itself as an information system that allows experienced soldiers to monitor the condition and security of their military community through sensory channels that remain active even during sleep. Your ears, trained by months of campaign life, have learned to process the camp's acoustic environment as a form of continuous intelligence gathering. The normal patterns of breathing, movement, and conversation create a baseline against which unusual sounds become immediately noticeable. When the pattern changes, when breathing becomes more rapid and shallow, indicating anxiety or illness, when movement increases, suggesting restlessness or preparation for activity, when conversations shift to more urgent tones, the trained military ear processes these changes as tactical intelligence about the Army's condition. The progression of sounds through the night hours provides information about the camp's overall health and readiness levels. Early evening conversations that focus on routine concerns gradually give way to the deeper, more personal discussions that men have when they believe themselves unobserved. Later still, as fatigue overcomes social inhibitions, the sounds of sleep reveal information about individual health conditions, stress levels, and psychological states that formal military inspection might not discover. Most importantly, your ears learn to distinguish between the sounds of normal military sleep and the acoustic patterns that indicate potential danger. The sudden cessation of natural sounds when horses stop their normal nighttime activities, or when the usual pattern of guard communications changes often provides the earliest warning of threats that visual observation might miss. The experienced military ear becomes capable of detecting changes in acoustic patterns that indicate enemy activity, whether changes or internal problems developing within the camp itself. Your sense of smell undergoes similar development as a military intelligence tool. The olfactory baseline established during normal camp conditions allows for the immediate detection of changes that might indicate danger or opportunity. The smell of smoke beyond what normal cooking and heating activities would produce could indicate fire threats or enemy signal activities. Changes in the scent of food storage areas might reveal spoilage problems before they create widespread illness. Most critically, the trained military nose can detect the distinctive sense associated with human fear, illness, or death before these conditions become visible through other means. But the sensory environment of military sleep serves psychological functions that prove equally important to maintaining fighting effectiveness. The familiar sounds and smells of camp life, however unpleasant they might be in absolute terms, create a sense of community and shared experience that bonds soldiers together in ways that more pleasant circumstances might not achieve. The knowledge that everyone endures the same sensory challenges creates psychological equality that transcends the formal hierarchies of military organization. The sensory intimacy imposed by close quarters military life where individual privacy becomes impossible and personal habits become community knowledge forces the development of tolerance, empathy, and mutual support that prove essential for combat effectiveness. Soldiers who have shared the experience of sleeping within the sound and scent of each other's most private human functions develop bonds of mutual understanding that cannot be created through formal military training or social interaction under normal circumstances. This enforced intimacy also creates practical knowledge about individual capabilities and limitations that proves crucial for tactical effectiveness. The soldier whose breathing patterns reveal chronic respiratory problems might need different assignments than those whose sleep sounds indicate robust health. The individual whose digestive issues create ongoing medical challenges requires different logistical support than those who tolerate campaign food without difficulty. This intimate knowledge of personal limitations and strengths allows military units to function with the kind of internal coordination that formal organization charts cannot provide. The sensory environment also serves as a mechanism for maintaining awareness of collective corporal and psychological condition. The sounds of confident conversation differ recognizably from those of anxious discussion. The sense associated with good health and adequate nutrition contrasts sharply with those that indicate malnutrition, illness, or psychological distress. Experienced military leaders learn to read these sensory indicators as measures of unit readiness that supplement and sometimes contradict formal reports. As dawn approaches and the sensory environment begins to change with the gradual return of light and the beginning of morning activities, you recognize that the night's acoustic and olfactory experiences have provided a form of continuous education about the human condition under stress. The sensory challenges of military sleep teach lessons about tolerance, adaptation, and mutual dependence that prove valuable far beyond their immediate military applications. The question that emerges from this understanding concerns the relationship between sensory experience and human development under extreme circumstances. Did the harsh sensory conditions of medieval military life serve to strengthen and educate the individuals who endured them, creating capabilities and understandings that could not be achieved through more comfortable circumstances? Or did these conditions primarily represent obstacles to human potential that medieval society lacked the resources to overcome? The complex sensory environment of Crusader camp sleep reveals both the limitations and the adaptability of human beings confronting circumstances that challenge basic preferences for comfort, privacy, and dignity. The sounds and smells of military rest speak to the costs of medieval warfare in terms of human welfare, but they also demonstrate the remarkable capacity of human communities to function effectively even when forced to endure conditions that assault every assumption about what civilized life requires. As morning light begins to filter through tent walls and the camp prepares for another day's march toward distant objectives, the sensory experiences of the night become memory, but their lessons remain embedded in the consciousness of those who live through them. The question that persists is whether these lessons represent growth and education through adversity, or simply adaptation to circumstances that no human beings should be forced to endure. And what does this sensory dimension of medieval military life reveal about the relationship between physical comfort and human dignity in circumstances where survival itself depends on collective endurance of individual hardship? The sounds and smells of night in a Crusader camp tell stories that go far beyond the immediate discomfort of inadequate sleeping conditions. They speak to fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the costs of achieving collective objectives through individual sacrifice. As you finally drift toward whatever rest these circumstances will allow, the sensory memories of the night become part of the accumulated experience that shapes not just military effectiveness, but understanding of what it means to be human in a world where comfort and dignity must be continuously earned through endurance and mutual support.